Hello and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller with me, Stephen E. Andrews, writer, bookseller, collector. You know the drill. And today I thought I'd talk about the importance of genre reissues because we live in a culture which is fixated on the new. Why this should be so, there's only one explanation, and that's because we've lived through modernism, we're now in postmodernism, and because of the rapid pace of change in cultural production due to the advance of technology from the Industrial Revolution right the way forward until probably 20, 30 years ago, things have moved faster and faster and faster. We've had more and more novelty, and as you can see, I'm going faster and faster and faster as well. And that pretty much explains why we've become addicted to novelty and the new, and that's probably why the media focus on the new. But as somebody once said, I can't think who it was, literature is news that stays news. And is this a news channel? Well, in that respect it is, because I often like to look at the literature of the past which has been neglected, which is often still with us and is often very good and much better than what's happening at the moment. And of course, as another wise man once said, was it Voltaire? I can never remember who said these things. There's just the words of wisdom themselves. They're the books of the moment and the books of all time. Well, I'm going to talk about 3 books today. Are they the books of all time? I wouldn't quite go that far, but they're certainly worth your attention. And reissues are important, and I want to focus on one publisher who fundamentally are a reissue publisher, and a lot of their books are print on demand, but that's because they're small sort of scale, small operation. They're not sort of going to get massive bestsellers, and that's a publisher called Valancourt, who are based in the US of A. They're a very Anglophile publisher. They issue lots of British books. They're mostly reissues. There are some more recent things, like for example, they publish the works of Stephen Gregory, the master of avian macabre, and his last book, called A Plague of Gulls, in the UK was a limited edition hardcover from PS, and in the States with Valancourt it's a trade paperback. So there you go. And recently, Valancourt got in touch with me because they were very pleased. They sold something like 600 copies in 1 week of the US edition of The Glamour by Christopher Priest after I did that video, the ultimate philosophical science fiction novel, which everybody in the universe watched, and then, hardly anybody actually read. That's the way these things go. Having said that, I know a lot of the viewers of this channel have read it and thoroughly enjoyed it. So I decided to have a look at Valancourt's books and to read 3 which I hadn't read before. I'm telling a lie here, one of them I had read before, but a very long time ago. So I'm going to do some reviews for you. Something that Valancourt have had quite a degree of success with in recent years is the Paperbacks from Hell imprint in the lovely A format, the classic pocket book that we all know and love. And this was inspired by Grady Hendrix's book Paperbacks from Hell, which was an overview of 70s and 80s horror and the way it was published and sold, particularly in the USA. It's got lots of great covers in it, and that book more than anything has been responsible for the resurgence in paperback horror collecting, and we're seeing really ratty old books in a terrible state changing hands for £100, which isn't healthy but is fun, and not for those paying for it, of course. But something that they did was they decided to do this reissue series, and this is one of them. This is Familiar Spirit by Lisa Tuttle. There are about, I think, 12 to 16, I think it's 12 of these in print. 2 of them are not available in the UK for copyright and market reasons, and they actually happen to be the ones by Lisa Tuttle because the rights to them are still held by UK publishers, and even though those UK publishers are not publishing them and haven't for years and years and years, decades, you can't import them and sell them. So I had to get this from the States. Valancourt kindly sent me this one because I'd not read this one, and I do like Lisa's work. They also do A Nest of Nightmares. This is the original Sphere first edition, and that's a great collection of short stories that I bought way back in the day, though that's not my original copy. That went a long time ago, and I got this from Dorset Bob. But I wanted to talk about these, and Lisa Tuttle, of course, her first novel was a co-authored novel with George R. R. Martin called Windhaven, which must have been about 1975, 76. And they were sort of partners then. They were a thing. They were Texans from the Austin area of Texas. I've never met her. She lives in the UK, has done since the 80s. She lives in Scotland, and very, very good writer. And Familiar Spirit is the title of the book. And as you see, it's got this jade figure there, which is very relevant to the text. And it's the use of the word familiar in terms of like a witch's familiar, like a cat or a toad or something of that kind. And what struck me about this is her first novel from 83, and I don't think it's been printed in the UK since about 83, because I've certainly never seen a UK copy of it. is it brings forward to you the difference between somewhere like Texas in the USA in the early 80s and the way that Britain was is hugely different. This book still has the feel of the whole post-hippie thing on there, and that's quite an interesting part of it. The basic setup is this. Is the central character is a lady called Sarah, who's a student in her 20s, and she has just broken up in a relationship with a guy called Brian, who she loves very much, and they've been in a sort of cramped apartment, but she's always had this thing about commitment, and it's not sort of phrased that way. That's a more modern way of putting it, a more contemporary way of putting it. And they split up, and he's met somebody else, and she's moved out, and she comes across this big old rambling house out in the country outside Austin in Texas. And if you're not familiar with Austin, I've never been there, but it's been a big centre, big music centre for many years. There's all country rock things there and what have you. And while she completes her studies, Sarah decides to move into this big house. She meets a woman called Valerie there, who's a bit strange and twitchy. And despite some misgivings, she moves into this rambling old house, and it's quite run down. And it all seems to be part of this kind of post-hippie milieu that you see in the book. Sarah has two friends, a couple called Pete and Beverly, who are also important in the plot, and she moves into the house and strange things start to happen, as you expect. As soon as you get a strange house in a horror book, you know that it's going to go down that way. And what's good about this is it's quite subtle. It doesn't rely on Gru, even though there are some nasty things happening to it and some sort of pretty scary and gruesome moments. It relies more on personality and on style. And even though this is a work of popular fiction, I wouldn't say it's literary. Not that it's badly written, not at all. But it is a story, and it is about telling the story through the characters. And in that way, Lisa shows her skill, because it's not just the supernatural stuff that's important. It is the characters and their dynamics that really drive the plot. And that's the mark of good writing, good fiction, particularly per se. Sarah begins to realise that something is wrong there, and I don't want to reveal too much, but I say this cover is quite relevant. There is a mention of a famous occult figure, which every sort of horror novelist after a certain date seems to name check, and I thought, oh, here we go. But it didn't go down that way. It went a different way, and it was more interesting. There's a marvellous flashback sequence which goes back to the 1920s, which is in a diary form, almost epistolary, which of course is letters, and that was really, really good. And even though I felt at, let's see how many pages, at 237 pages, I felt it was a bit long. I felt if it had come in at around about 210, it would have been perfect. So I did feel that it was padded. It just didn't feel that necessary for it to be quite that long. I think it could have cut to the chase a bit more and been a little bit sharper. But I really enjoyed it, and comparing the sort of post-hippie milieu of early 80s Austin to what was happening in Britain, it was so different, really, really interesting. It seemed very much stuck in the past. It could have been set anytime in the 70s or the 60s, and you could have done the same plot and it wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever. The character reactions are really good. They're well drawn, and particularly good is the fact that the book dwells a lot on sexuality and on Sarah's particular personality and her love for her estranged partner, Brian, and how her sexuality sort of is the sort of gateway, as it were, for things to happen. So it is a good little book. I do recommend it. If you've never read Lisa, do read some of her stuff. I do wish somebody would reissue Memories of the Body, which is one I used to have in Seven House, and I don't have it anymore. It's a super rare book. Really, really good. So you can get that from Paperbacks from Hell. You can get these online, but you won't find them in a UK bookshop, these two. And you can get Nest of Nightmares, which is a really good short story collection with a cracking cover. Look at that. Isn't that fantastic? So that's Familiar Spirit. And as I say, there's lots of others in this list. There's some really interesting books in this list, actually. Then, moving on to a science fiction novel. This was something which I'd wanted to read for years and years and years. And I wasn't sure whether I really wanted to go down that route. I thought, is this just going to be something to throw away? And this is a book called Only Lovers Left Alive by Dave Wallace, and this is like a real cult book. You never hear much about this at all, and it was published in 1964 in the UK. Dave Wallace was a British writer, and you could say that he came from a fairly traditional conservative background in a way, but he was very compassionate, and my fear about this was this would just be like a pre-Richard Allen teen exploitation book, but it wasn't. It was more to it. So it came out in 1964, which is about 3 years after A Clockwork Orange, and it is worth comparing to that. The basic idea of this is that you have contemporary Britain at that time, and older people, anybody older than sort of a teenager, their 20s, once people get to about their 40s, are committing suicide, and they're committing suicide in larger numbers than ever before. And the authorities are trying to keep it quiet, but it is becoming more and more of a thing. And it opens with a classroom scene where a teacher is talking about statistics with suicide, and he's got this class of kids who supposedly are lower sixth, but with the actual characters, I can't imagine any of them actually being lower sixth. And fundamentally, that would be high school for the States, I guess. And he's talking to them, and they're fairly surly and what have you, and the bell goes and out they go. And he wanders over to a window and he's pondering to himself, and he's middle-aged, and all of a sudden he gets this urge to throw himself out of the window, and he does, and that's how the book begins. The action then flips to a sort of coffee bar scenario. So in terms of today's counterculture, if there is such a thing, which I don't think there is, it seems quite sort of quaint and dated, but it does reflect the times. It's slightly behind because they're talking about trad jazz and things like that. And you've got to remember at this point, the Beatles have only just sort of got going, so it's not quite as up to date as it could have been. I don't think he had his finger quite on the pulse. And it focuses really on this gang from a certain street, Seeley Street in the East End. And there are sort of three main characters. There's Kathy, who's like the really good looking girl in the gang. And there's Ernie Wilson, which of course made me think of Colin Wilson, and Charlie Burroughs, which of course made me think of William S. Burroughs. And I'm wondering whether those were, definite sort of picks, whether they were chosen because those names were chosen because of those counterculture writers. It's a possibility, of course. And they're the sort of heads of this gang. And, they're not really bad kids. They're sort of like vaguely hooliganish. They have scooters and what have you. And they sort of tootle around doing stuff. And through their eyes, you gradually see society start to collapse as more and more mature people begin to do away with themselves. And this is never, ever explained. And that's one of the strengths of the book, is that you never know. It's unspecified why this is happening. And the Rolling Stones were interested in this book at one point. It was quite culty, and they were going to appear in a film of it. And it does tell you in the introduction here, which is really good, about why the film didn't happen and all around that. So it's worth reading for that reason. And you can actually see Mick and Keith. You can imagine Mick and Keith and Marianne Faithfull in it. It would work really well, except they were probably too old by the time it would have been made, which would have been about 66 was the time it was supposed to be made, and it didn't happen. So you see society collapse, and the kids, of course, are having a great time. They're partying every night, they're drinking, what have you. But then, of course, the inevitable happens. Food starts to get short. Everybody forms into gangs. Law and order is broken down, and society kind of collapses. And there's some very, very quirky things. Like, for example, there's one point where there's an organisation called Nat Bingo, which is short for the National Bingo Organisation Committee. And they run these bingo games in old cinemas and what have you. And they are sort of set up at Windsor Castle, and they have the uniforms with red jackets, and they seem to be like the big gang and things. But you gradually see things fall apart. And then it transmutes, just as you would think, into a classic English catastrophe novel. And I must admit, my attention sagged a little bit after a while. But the writing is good, the characters are well drawn, and they become more humane and realistic as the narrative goes on. And the ending, although it's kind of a quiet ending, had the sort of abrasive quality that you have in Threads, the film Threads about nuclear apocalypse. That's the last part of that, which is, nuclear winter is really powerful. And it's going to be refilmed, and I'm sure they'll make a hell of a mess of it. And also, there was something about it that reminded me of Earth Abides. It doesn't have that incredible strength that Earth Abides has at the end, but it does have that. And it also made me think of Richard Jefferies, whose classic catastrophe novel, After London, Wild England, I mentioned a while ago in a video. And so it is an interesting one. So it's a combination of youth exploitation, Clockwork Orange type thing, and a catastrophe novel. And it's worthy of your attention. It's not a stone cold classic, but it's exactly the kind of thing that does need reissuing so that people can look down these little avenues and byways and find that very often the things they think are new have been done a long time ago and often quasi-forgotten. And for that reason alone, I'm very glad I read it, and it's going to stay in the library. It's a good little book. The more I think about it, the more I warm to it, it has to be said. Finally, I'm going to talk about a book by one of my favourite writers, and it's a book of his which never really stuck with me at the time, and I first read it back in the 90s, and that's Colin Wilson, and the particular book is The Glass Cage, and this is the Valancourt edition, of course. And The Glass Cage, he wrote this in, let's see, this came out in 1966, and is set largely in London, though there is a wonderful opening section which is set up north in a very rural location. And Wilson himself at the time said that it was his favourite of his novels. Now, at that point, he hadn't written any of his SF novels. He'd written these sort of metaphysical crime novels, which aren't really crime novels. They often have crimes in them and a little bit of detection, but they're not really genre crime novels. There's something different. They're more philosophical. And in a way, Wilson himself and other people have compared this to his first novel, Ritual in the Dark, which I'm going to show you now, which is one of my favourite books of all time. This is my mid-80s copy of Ritual in the Dark. I do have a first edition as well. Look at that, the spine's faded terribly. And as you see, it's a chunky tome. And this was the book he was writing for quite a long time when he was sort of virtually down and out. And then he came upon the idea of writing The Outsider, his famous non-fiction book, which propelled him to instant fame. And this is a fantastic book, and I have talked about it several times, but fundamentally it's about three different types of outsiders in London, late 50s, early 60s, and it's a wonderful portrait of the city at that time. And there is a serial killer in the background who is committing these Jack the Ripper type murders, and it's all about the sort of meaning of life and, you know, why would somebody commit murder. I don't want to talk too much about that, but it is kind of reflected in The Glass Cage. And The Glass Cage begins, as say, in a rural location. And the central character is a guy called Damon Reed, who is a scholar of William Blake. And interestingly, one of Colin's sons was called Damon. A friend of mine years ago in the 90s said that he'd been in school with Damon down in Cornwall. And Damon Reed is this Blake scholar. He's writing things. He lives in this really run-down sort of cottage. He's got a goat as the middle of nowhere. He seems to like being apart from the world, which is a typical sort of Blakey-and mystical thing. And a policeman travels all the way from London to talk to him about some murders happening in London. At the scenes of these murders, the perpetrator has chalked up slogans, but they're not slogans, they're actually quotations from William Blake, and they've worked that out at least. So they go to Damon Reed as a Blake scholar and say, can you help us? And initially he's not really interested. And there is an interesting thing where he has a friend who runs a second-hand bookshop in the village, some way away from his cottage. And he goes down there, and the chap who runs a second bookshop has a young daughter. She's only about 16, and she's formed a romantic attachment to Damon, who's at least 20 years older than her. And you can see, you know, to the contemporary eye, this would seem like to be quite a little bit dodgy. And there is one moment in there which is really quite strange, where the foster father lifts the hem of the skirt of the young girl to show what she's wearing underneath. And it's really quite weird. And it's that thing which today I don't think that would happen in a book, unless, you know, it was a crime novel where they were trying to expose that sort of psychopathology. And it really sort of stood out. And this is one of his books which seems to me to appear more of its time than a lot of the others. Strangely enough, I don't think Ritual of the Dark is of its time. I think it's still incredibly relevant and comparable today. And also The World of Violence, another fantastic book of his as well, which I really love. This is another early one. So Reed, anyway, goes down after this strange interlude where he agrees to become this girl's fiancée, and she's all for it. So it is that age gap thing, which a lot of people find very, very odd. And he goes down to London, stay with some friends. He stays with a composer who's an avant-garde composer, who's quite a hip guy. And Wilson's really good at describing the sort of demi-monde of London in the 60s. He's brilliant at that. He did that in several novels. And he sort of visits the crime scenes and gradually comes to realise that there might be something he can do. He looks at the correspondence he's received and crank letters he's had from Blake fans all over the world, and he identifies somebody called Gaylord Sondheim. And this is a really big guy. He's like a big sort of tall strapping bloke, and he meets up with him and he says, but he can't be the murderer, he's too intelligent. And yet at the same time, Gaylord Sondheim has these enormous appetites for violence, food and sex, which are hard for him to quench. And he's a very interesting character. And the glass cage refers to the fact that Gaylord Sondheim has a pet snake. It's a python in a sort of terrarium, or whatever you call it. It's not a terrarium, is it? And it is interesting because it's about the metaphysics of crime and why would somebody do it and what does that say about them, and can they be helped. So it isn't your conventional crime novel. I enjoyed it. My original copy was the Village Press original edition, which is a really ratty little paperback, a very, very rare book. And what struck me the most about this, reading it again, was the opening sections in the rural part, the questionable part with the just over age girl, and the way that Damon comes out of himself as he goes to London and engages with the demi-monde there. And it's an interesting book. It's still not one of my favourite Wilson books. I've read all of them at least twice in most cases. There's some of the more minor novels I need to reread again. It's going to stay in the library because my Village Press edition was just horrible, and that's gone, and this is a really nice production. And it was interesting to revisit it after such a long time. And Wilson was somebody I was really, really sort of enamoured of in the early 90s. Now I'm slightly less so. I can see more and more why the critics weren't keen on a lot of the things he did and the things he would say and what have you. But I still think that some of his novels are fascinating, and as thought experiments and as philosophical novels, merging the philosophical novel with the popular novel, he was just brilliant at that. So I think if you could pick up Ritual in the Dark, which actually Valancourt do, I would say. I think they also do The World of Violence. They do most of his novels in the States. They're in print. So if you're in the States, a lot of them you can get in the UK. You need to get them from Amazon or something because they're not generally distributed to the UK book trade. I would really recommend them. So if you've not read Wilson before and you want to read one of his novels, I wouldn't go for The Glass Cage first. I would very, very much go for Ritual in the Dark. I think it's a fantastic book. And again, I would also really recommend The World of Violence. I mean, what a great title. Fancy calling a novel The World of Violence. Fantastic, isn't it? So that's a little insight into some things that Valancourt do. Have a look at their website. It's fantastic. There's all sorts of great stuff on there. There's writers you will not have heard of. There's writers who are forgotten like John Blackburn and Francis King. Writers like Stephen Gregory who deserve a lot more attention. And it's just a really amazing list. And I do wish there were more reissues happening. If you look at SF, particularly in the UK, there's not a lot of reissues now, of course. Gollancz Masterworks do some, but a lot of the publishers have lost interest in doing the backlist, and it's a real shame, you know, because there's some great stuff out there. The books of all time as opposed to the books of the moment, as I say. There's certainly things on the Valancourt list, including those who are well worth your attention. So thanks for watching. Special thanks to members who are in the club room. It's only $4.99 a month for an exclusive video every week, and I think there's now over 50 videos there in the backlist, and of course there's more to come, one every week, as I say. And you know, I hope you're having a nice time. Tell me what you're reading and I'll let you know what I think or if I've heard of it. It's always great to hear from you, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.